Hello, everybody. Welcome. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Ed Finn. I'm the founding director of the Center for Science and the Imagination at Arizona State University, and I'm the academic director of Future Tense. Future Tense is a partnership between ASU and New America, and we're really excited for this event today and grateful that you're able to spend some time with us to talk about hopeful climate futures in the present. So I'm going to take a minute to talk about this project and this long train ride that we've been on to arrive at this moment, and then turn it over to my collaborator, Joey, to talk a little bit about it. I'll introduce our panelists and we'll get into our discussion. So in 2020, we started to think about a new project around climate futures and storytelling. We were reacting to a few different things. 2020 was the COVID-19 pandemic, and we saw dramatic changes. It's the only year that we've actually successfully reduced carbon emissions in at least some local areas and some local contexts. And it was a reminder that so many of our decisions around climate are really social and imagination decisions more than technical decisions. And we have to, if we want to change our relationship with the planet, we need to start with the stories that we tell about that relationship. And there was also this observation that decades of scientific consensus and evidence-based argument were not effectively moving the needle to change our relationship with fossil fuels. And also that the stories we tell about the future tend to be fairly negative. There's a lot of anxiety. There's even some despair around climate and futures, especially when you talk to young people. And the stories that we tell tend to be stories of all the bad things that are going to happen. The negative impacts, the floods, the fires, those things are real. Those things are happening now, but somehow they haven't seemed like quite enough to actually change our conversation and motivate large-scale transformational change. So these were some of the inspirations, the starting points for our effort to say, well, maybe we need to be telling different stories about climate and hopeful climate futures. How do we imagine the futures that we actually want? What would victory conditions look like? Not a future where magically climate change has somehow disappeared or never existed, but futures in which we can define success, define human thriving, flourishing, positive relationships with the natural world that inspire us to change in the present. So that was really the beginning. In 2021, we secured a grant from the ClimateWorks Foundation, which has really been instrumental in supporting this work throughout our progress, our trip on this long train ride. We also worked with many other wonderful partners along the way. That initial grant allowed us to select 4 climate imagination fellows, speculative fiction writers from different regions of the world who all contributed to this project of imagining hopeful climate futures. We worked with TED and TED Countdown, the UN climate champions, participated in things at the Glasgow COP event way back in 2021, and many other partners along the way, like the British Library, the Hay Festival. And all of those events and conversations have been building towards this book, which we're very excited to share with you all. Climate Imagination, Dispatches from Hopeful Futures, and also really excited to have some of our contributors from the book here today. And I want to turn things over to my partner in crime, Joey Esherick, who co-edited this book with me, to talk a little bit more about it and why we're so excited to see it out in the world. Over to you, Joey.
Thanks, Ed, and hello, everyone. Thanks for being here with us. This book, Climate Imagination, Dispatches from Hopeful Futures, was published by MIT Press on December 2nd, so just last week. The book is a collection of original works of speculative fiction, essays in a range of styles, some of them leaning a bit more scholarly, some quite a bit more personal, some a bit experimental. We also have visual art, and all of these pieces are exploring hopeful futures shaped by climate action. And these visions of the future unfold in what we call a diverse range of physical and human geographies around the world. And our contributors to the book accordingly represent 17 different countries all across the globe. In this book, in Climate Imagination, we imagine climate action, coordinated human responses to climate change, as a process that grows from the bottom up, that spreads from the bottom out, that isn't imposed as a one-size-fits-all measure from somewhere on high. And so the stories and essays that you'll find in the book privilege local knowledge and insight, and they demonstrate that just like the climate crisis looks really different in each unique place, mobilizing climate action looks really different too. So both climate stress and climate action are going to take really different forms in Beijing, in Nigeria's Delta states, in the Orkney Islands off the coast of Scotland, in the Pampas grasslands in Argentina, and visions of livable and even thriving futures on this planet we think are more compelling when they capture the complex dynamics of these particular places and life that call those places home instead of just taking place in a sort of future elsewhere, no place, global generality. So we hope you enjoy what you find in the book, and we'll get to talk a good bit more about it, and particularly about Manana and Vandana's contributions and chapters in the book. Before I hand it back over to Ed, he's gonna moderate the conversation with the two of them. I do want to share that we had planned to have an additional guest with us today. His name is Yudanjaya Wijeratne. And Yuda is an incredibly talented science fiction writer, as well as a journalist and data scientist. He's from Colombo, which is the largest city in Sri Lanka. And he lives on a homestead that he constructed for himself from climate-friendly earth bags in a place called Kandy, which is a historically important city in the center of the country. About 2 weeks ago, as many of you probably know, Sri Lanka was struck, along with large parts of South Asia and other spaces, by Cyclone Ditwa. That caused widespread flooding, which has affected more than 2 million people. And in Sri Lanka, the flooding reached 1 in 12 buildings across the country. So the government has declared a state of emergency, which is ongoing and controversial, and there have been major interruptions to electricity and water services. Um, and I know those have affected Yuta and a lot of people he knows. The flooding has been described by scientists as rare and record-breaking, and many have attested to the role played by climate change in making these storms particularly dangerous. Say and wish that we could have his voice and perspective in this conversation. I should stress that he's safe, but he's dealing with quite a lot at the moment, understandably, and he isn't able to be here with us. I do just want to say his chapter in the book is well worth checking out. I hope you all find it and read it. It is called The Unwalkable City. In it, Yuta uses data, historical analysis, and firsthand experience to explore the crisis of urban heat in Colombo. There's even a part of the chapter where he and his friends go around with these surface heat monitors all around the city and construct these graphs and charts to really get a sense of how heat is affecting people, and talks to old folks in his community and stuff who've lived in the city for years to figure out how it's changing. Um, in that chapter, he locates the roots of that crisis in colonialism and decades of deleterious decisions about urban planning and infrastructure. And he describes the way that urban heat in Colombo restricts movement and access to the city for everyday people. And he wraps up very appropriately for our book by talking about really concrete paths forward. He writes about alternative and indigenous modes of construction, drawing particularly on his own experiences designing and building his own home out of these earth bags. But he also examines changes in permitting and regulation that could help solve the problem, and identifies existing local institutions and instruments of government in Sri Lanka that could be part of improving the situation. So it captures a lot of threads in our book about imagining different futures and also identifying sort of concrete pathways and actions that people could take. And it's just beautifully and passionately written. So please check out his chapter if that sounds interesting. And also you can find more of his fiction and nonfiction writing at yudanjaya.com. And we'll add that link to the chat for everyone. It's YUDHANJAYA.com. Okay, well, having said that, I am glad that our other two guests are able to be with us here today, and that all of you took the time to spend with us to celebrate the launch of this book. So I'll give the baton back to Ed to take this conversation forward. Thanks.
Thank you, Joey. All right, without further ado, let me introduce our panelists and jump into our conversation. And as a reminder, you're invited. We'd love to hear from you. Please share comments and questions in that chat box to the right of the video window, and we'll be turning to them after we have a little bit of a discussion among ourselves here. So Vandana Singh is an author of speculative fiction, a professor of environment, society, and sustainability at Framingham State University, and a transdisciplinary scholar of the climate crisis. And I should mention, a very longtime friend and collaborator of ours at the center. So very excited to be talking with her again. She's the author of 2 short story collections and more recently a chapbook of essays and stories, Utopias of the Third Kind. Her academic work on a justice-centered approach to the climate crisis has also led to a book called Teaching Climate Change: Science, Stories, and Justice. She is a theoretical physicist by training and was born and brought up in New Delhi and now lives near Boston. And our second speaker, Manjana Milkereit, is a researcher at the Stockholm Resilience Center at Stockholm University. She explores environmental governance and cognitive theory to understand global responses to the climate crisis. She has studied and conducted research in Norway, Germany, Canada, and the United States, including right here at Arizona State University, another longtime friend and collaborator of ours at CSI. And she is the author of the book Mind-Made Politics: The Cognitive Roots of Global Climate Governance. She's also one of the co-founders of the Imagination and Climate Futures Initiative here at ASU with CSI, and was instrumental in Everything Change, our series of global climate fiction contests and anthologies. And excitingly, yesterday I learned that Manjana has just won this major European Research Council grant for 2.8 million euros to research capacities for more effective long-term climate change governance. So that's fantastic news, and I'm really excited to see how that project unfolds. Okay, enough from me and from Joey. Let's get into it. So I'd like to start by asking each of you to talk a little bit about the chapters that they were stories about climate action in a specific place. I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about the settings of your contributions and the way that climate issues are manifesting in those places and how you imagine prospects for more hopeful futures. Vandana, maybe we could start with you.
So thank you, Ed, and thank you, Joey, and thank you, New America. And it's really an honor to be here with Manjana, and we are missing Yudha. Let me start by saying that I've been experimenting with regard to the structure of stories a little bit, because the climate crisis, it kind of violates so many of our standard, globalized conventions. Like it spans large scales of space and time, for instance. And so the local matters as much as the global. And which is why I love this project, because you're really rooting it in place. But at the same time, I wanted to also network different local places and different environments. So that's what I tried to do with the story I wrote for this book. And I also wanted to network or consider different worlds, different possible future worlds, and different social classes as well. So in that sense, the a couple of important places where the story is rooted. It's set in India, where I'm from, and a couple of the important places are a region in Jharkhand, the state of Jharkhand in India, which is one of the most climate vulnerable regions and used to be once covered with thick forests, but it has been really desertified because of various reasons for deforesting, including quarrying, mining, road building, and so on. And the other place that is important in this story is the Sundarbans, which is the largest mangrove forest in the world off the coast of India and Bangladesh. And here, what I emphasize, and this is based on inspiration from real life grassroots endeavors, are the roles of local and indigenous peoples in self-governance, in grasping their futures in their own hands. And at the same time, while doing that, helping to shift the world in a different direction. So those are two of the places, but it's also set in a city, essentially Delhi, and then across social classes. So a billionaire is one of the characters. And that's partly because I was really fascinated by how the super elite, super rich think. And that huge rupture with reality that they have, and why and how that's part of the problem that we face. So it cuts across social classes and locations. Yeah.
Manjana, how about you?
Yeah, first of all, thank you for inviting me, and also especially maybe a thank you to Joey because he really encouraged me to be part of this project. I should start by saying that based on my expertise, I'm not a fiction writer, and my work focuses very much on the global kind of the generality of nowhere that Joey mentioned earlier. So for me, moving to the local, where all of these changes, of course, take place, is a real challenge. And it did challenge me to write and also to maybe to speak this evening with all of you about the story. But my story is based in a city called Stavanger at the southwest coast of Norway. I moved to Norway just a few years ago, and I'm still learning about the place. But Stavanger is a really interesting place because it is both very beautifully located coastal city with a rich history tied to the ocean, to fishing, maritime trade, and all those things. But it is also the oil capital of Norway, or the energy capital of Norway. This is where Equinor's headquarters is based, and this is where basically since the 1970s, um, Norway's big oil industry has grown or was born, if you will. And so its history is closely tied to the making of climate change, to the maintaining of climate change as a problem. And my story then builds on that and looks into Stavanger's future in the 1960s, and to ask how does it deal not only with the impacts of climate change, because it will have to change as well as already experiencing significant challenges related to climate change that relate particularly to increased precipitation and storm surges and floods. I should mention Stavanger, as a coastal city with an Atlantic climate, has a lot of rain. It rains almost every other day of the year. And it's gray, so the winter is super cold. It has no snow, but it has lots of precipitation, and it's likely to have more precipitation in the future, so even more rain, more gray, more sheet. And so they're looking towards wilder and wetter climate futures in that sense. And they're dealing with sea level rise. It's a fairly flat area where the city is located. And so water matters, and water there changes. So and the story kind of picks that up. In the year 2067 through the lens of the city's adaptation officer, if you will, person responsible for managing adaptation plans. And that person having to deal with a climate-related problem that I think a lot about right now, and that is Earth system tipping points or climate tipping points. And particularly, I don't know if you've heard about it, of our climate system could, under certain circumstances, relatively rapidly shift from their current stable state to a very different state. For example, that our major ice sheets could melt down and disappear, or that the Amazon rainforest, for example, could die back towards savanna. And then there's this interesting Earth system that's called the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation. It's a major invisible to us ocean circulation that actually connects all continents via the oceans and transports massive amounts of heat across the planet. And that, turns out, could shut down with major implications for human well-being everywhere around the world, but very specifically in Northern Europe and in a place like Stavanger, where if the AMOC were to shut down, the future there would look completely different. Northern Europe would massively cool. We would have extremely cold winters. There would be sea ice coming all the way Stavanger and even all the way further south, which Stavanger never sees. So it would turn adaptation planning completely on its head and create massive challenges. I'm trying to put the reader into the shoes of the person who has to deal with that information, that is the scientific information that is uncertain and hard to respond to. So yeah, that is where I'm trying to take my reader.
Well, thank you both. One thing that you're both contending with is this idea of different places, different worlds being woven together, but also different times and relationships to time. How do you plan for something that might happen 50 years from now or 100 years from now? How do we see the larger catastrophes of climate change when we're really only looking out one window in one place at a time? And another way of thinking about that might be the idea of pacing. You know, how do you respond? How quickly or slowly can communities move? How quickly should they move? And are you moving at the speed of building solidarity and building trust? And if we're going to operate at that local level, how do you build up and out? How do you move from local to broader regional action or even just a sense of shared engagement, a shared imagination of what we were doing. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how the linking and coordination of smaller scale and more precisely targeted or localized efforts can work and build and grow in the context of this emergency that paradoxically seems to move very slowly and then also very quickly, as Manana mentioned, with these tipping points and potential radical changes that could happen seemingly overnight. So maybe Vandana, we'll go back to you first for this as well.
Yeah, I have to say that what you described is actually a dream that I hope will come true, that all these local movements can be networked to actually shift the direction and confront power. And I'm inspired in particular by there are at least there's several hundred grassroots, very localized movements in India, which experiment with alternatives. And some of them, and many of them are led by some of the most marginalized peoples who have their own knowledge systems, for example, that have been, and so there's actually a website and a project that seeks to collect these efforts across the country and to coordinate them so that, for example, one example I know about is how villagers in one coastal region of India who suffered saltwater intrusion due to the 2004 tsunami, and then figured out how to desalinate their soil, okay, through certain kinds of plants and so on that absorbed a lot of the soil and so on. They were actually through projects like the one I'm describing, they were actually able to go to another part of the country, in fact, to the Sundarbans area where something similar had happened, and actually advise the farmers there how to desalinate their soil so that within a year or two, they could go back to growing crops. So, of course, these are very small scale, and at the moment, they don't have the power to shift consciousness and to shift policy and so on and so forth. But this project that I spoke of actually is trying to connect these movements together so that they can actually shake the foundations of the power system that has us, in its grasp. And there's also an international effort towards this called the Global Tapestry of Alternatives. So in some of the ways, this was kind of what I was working on in my story as well, that somehow bottom up has to meet top down. The people who decide policy, the people who are doing the governance bit and so on are typically so distanced from the realities on the ground that it's hard to imagine that they would actually produce something meaningful to local people. And so I think it's really, really important to cut across that divide and actually have people live with local communities, people who typically would be in air-conditioned urban city centers and be making policy, actually live with local peoples in different places and really understand that there are different ways of looking at the problem, and that the people who they seek to help, or at least say they seek to help, actually have a lot of agency, creativity, and sheer guts and courage to do what most of us are probably not doing. So that's how I think about it, and I hope I'll see this dream come true in my lifetime.
Yeah, Manana, I'd love to hear you reflect on this as well, especially as somebody who has researched some of this global policy and governance architecture and also now written about it in a more local context.
Yeah, so you called it the pace, the challenge of the pace of change, right? So where we are concerned, or at least I am concerned about how quickly we are developing these solutions when they have to be grounded in local realities and in what you call the speed of trust, and how to match that with the really rapidly advancing problem of climate change, which, as you said, I look at primarily from a global perspective, where it's so clear that we are we're not fast enough with any of the things we've been doing, right? In terms of mitigation primarily, but also in terms of adaptation and dealing with the impacts we're experiencing. We're always behind. And so speed, pace or speed really matters. And if you look at these amazing local stories that we have collected in this book, for example, or the ones that Wanda and I just mentioned, they by themselves are so important and they need to be grounded in local realities. But the question really is, how do you generate the speed up and out from them? How do you help scale? And I think that in itself is a distinct governance task that requires dedicated resources. And a part of it is what Vandana said, that's networking people, right? If you have all these local scale, let's call them experiments with solutions, it would be terrific to link them to other communities with similar problems, where the networking could highways of information flows and inspiration, if you will, that could be much faster than maybe we think of as in terms of these changes than we imagined so far. So networking across them and generating infrastructure, networked and nested across scales infrastructures for knowledge and experience sharing that would enable scaling and maybe even generate something that we often describe as maybe positive social tipping points, where ideas or behaviors or technology adoption expands and spreads in also nonlinear fashion, similar to these earth tipping points I mentioned. Those kinds of dynamics can happen within social systems as well under certain conditions. And then again, the networks between communities and ideas matter. Other maybe digital information tools that enable those information flows as well, or storytelling that enables the movement of these ideas through different communities rapidly. Those things might help create speed or accelerate the things that we have and the solutions that we create.
Could I add something, Ed?
Please.
Yeah. I wanted to mention, and thank you, Manjana, because I'm a little familiar with your work on sociological tipping points, and I'm looking forward to digging deeper into them. Because one of the things I do when I teach is to teach about complex systems, and then the analogs between the climatic systems, including Earth system boundaries and so on, and also sociological systems, which is not my field, so I'm eager to learn more about those. But I also wanted to mention one really interesting effort that is people who are typically at the top-down level, like climate scientists studying global climate change, really trying to look at things from a local scale in different parts of the world. And that is the World Climate Research Programme's lighthouse activity initiative called My Climate Risk, which I have the honor to be associated with. I lead their education working group. And it's really, really interesting because they've set up a number of hubs, mostly in the global south. And the hubs are typically universities and so on. But what they're really engaging in doing is working with communities, which could be anything from municipalities to farmers to indigenous people, so as to see how to make climate science information meaningful and actionable. Because, climate science tends to average out things, right? We talk about 1.5 C global temperature rise and so on. But what that means in locales and localities is like completely different from place to place, right? And that abstraction tends not to have as much meaning. So it's a really, really interesting attempt to start from the bottom up and then see how to meet the top down. So I just wanted to mention that.
Thank you for adding that. And it sets up nicely this next question I wanted to ask. I really like that idea of positive social tipping points. And I think it's no coincidence, Vandana, that so many of your stories engage with networks, metaphors of entanglement, and complex systems that have many different modes of interaction. And so I just wanted to ask you both, what are some examples of those positive social tipping points? What are some moments we could imagine or maybe have seen in the real world where this kind of change can happen?
Well, maybe I can start with that one. So, again, my work tends to be not at that local scale, maybe where we were trying to to go tonight or today. But the key examples in the work I'm engaged in very often start with technology adoption. For example, how quickly are we adopting solar power or electric vehicles? And often Norway is one of the key examples where the market is now such that the adoption of EVs has accelerated rapidly, and we're almost close to 100% of newly sold vehicles all being EV. So Norway has reached a tipping point in terms of electric vehicles is often the key example. But we can also think about many other examples in terms of, for example, people shifting their diets or their kinds of behaviors that have environmental impacts, or transportation behaviors where new kinds of patterns of doing things or thinking and of acting can spread rapidly in communities, local communities, cities, regions, and so forth. And maybe from my efforts to learn about Stavanger and write about Stavanger, one of the initiatives there, or kind of a pattern that I see emerging there and that might spread regionally as something like a social tipping point that's desirable, is the use of, first of all, very participatory approaches to city climate governance. For example, they developed something called a climate city contract that involved citizens, public officials, the city's business communities, but also academics to jointly sign a contract in terms of how to respond to this. It's kind of one of those trust building measures. But they have, in terms of the solutions to climate change, since they have, I told you, all these water related issues with more water, more storm surge, water intrusion, and so forth, they have to deal with that. They are moving towards something that they call green-blue infrastructure, which is ways of using existing streams and wetlands and open parks to work with the water rather than keeping it out. It's kind of a nature-based solution for flood management, for example, that combines the need to respond to climate change adaptation with kind of local values. When in Norway they have this very strong friluftsliv, like living with nature, being close to nature, out in nature a lot. So people walk a lot and are outdoors a lot. That combine that, so they give people spaces to walk and to move and to run and to be present in nature, but also offer a climate solution. So that is a very culturally embedded local solution, and that is kind of spreading in that region. So I think that that is a nice example of what could turn into a social tipping point.
Well, I don't know enough about social tipping points, but I can tell you some of the things that inspire me uh, uh, is that, well, I think Ursula Le Guin said this really beautifully, that, um, you know, there was a time when, I can't quote her directly right now, but there was a time when people believed in Europe, believed in the divine right of kings. And that went away, so things change. And that's also one of the things that strikes me when we try to imagine the future, that mostly we simply linearly extend the present. We don't imagine really disruptive major shifts, and they do happen. And so in the history of any country, like in the United States, for example, if you think about the impact of the civil rights movement, or if you think about the impact of the struggle of disabled people for rights, right? And how that changed everything, including attitudes, and how that normalized that you need to have, accessibility and so on and so forth, right? And nobody protests, or at least where I am, nobody thinks about protesting about those things. So I think that attitudes can change and society can change, but not without struggle and not without, there is a study from Harvard that says that it takes about 3% of the population to be involved in social change for the change to happen, or at least that's the minimum percentage or something. I don't know how widely that applies or anything, but I think that that's at least hopeful, that we don't need every single person to change their mind or change their lives and their attitudes. With regard to some of the things that I've been seeing that I have some familiarity with, either through readings or through deeper engagement, I have seen change happen in communities in Jharkhand, the state in India that's so climate vulnerable, because I'm connected to those communities through friends, activist friends who work there, and have spoken remotely to the villagers in those communities. And so, for instance, women who led the protection of their forests and the regeneration of their forests, that has changed their communities in a very drastic and positive way. Groundwater levels have gone 10 feet up in some places. The forests have come back. Wildlife is coming back. People who were forced to work in quarries because their agriculture, subsistence agriculture failed, are now coming back to their fields and are able to grow 2 crops a year, let alone 1 crop a year. So I have seen this kind of change. And this has literally happened in like 4 years of women particularly, but also men, confronting power, and at the same time using their own knowledge systems and with a little help from outside folks who are really, who are developing a collaborative, equitable, marginalized communities. They've really got back their food security, their food sovereignty. And so I think that, and at the same time, because they have, they've regenerated their forests, and then that the neighboring villagers are also saying, what did you guys do? We want to do the same thing. So they're actually able now to advise other villagers, and we are trying to, or my friends are trying to help network this to regenerate people's lives, livelihoods, food security and sovereignty, as well as the forests and the biodiversity. So these are pretty amazing.
Thank you for sharing those. Yeah, one thing I think about a lot is who is empowered and invited to imagine the future, and how can communities feel empowered to imagine their own futures. I see a lot of the work of this project and the work that we do at the center more generally as building imaginative capacity and sort of trying to support people and empower people in imagining their own futures. And so I wanted to ask you both about the role of storytelling in that work. It's a underlying premise of this project that we need different stories about the future. I love the Le Guin reference, right? That we can tell different stories, and by telling different stories, you can change the world. So what roles can stories of climate futures, new imaginations of the future play in addressing the climate crisis? What can they help us achieve? What are the powers and the limitations of that kind of storytelling?
Do you want me to start?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Yeah, well, I've, as a writer of speculative fiction, which includes science fiction and some kinds of fantasy as well sometimes, I really believe in the revolutionary power of speculative fiction in a couple of ways. So the asking a what if question, like what if things were different, not just in terms of technology, but in terms of social arrangements and power arrangements, that itself is a revolutionary question, because it makes us look around at our defaults and say, well, is there something better than this? So I think speculative fiction and stories in general can do it in a couple of ways. One is as cautionary tales that, by presenting dystopian futures and saying, look, if we keep doing what we're doing, we'll end up like that. And I think that they have a role to play, but by themselves, they may even be counterproductive, which is why we need stories that are brave enough and also realistic enough that, as you mentioned earlier, Ed, in your introduction, that we want stories to be rooted in reality. We don't want to be Pollyanna-ish about it. We don't want to pretend that everything's going to be magically okay. It's not. We have to walk through that valley of horror and despair with as much as possible, due to our privileged positions, with the people who suffer the worst impacts of these crises, and we have to do that, and we have to find. I don't know whether to call it hope or resolve or determination or whatever it is, and at one level, enough love for the world, for people, for future generations, to just give us the courage to keep going and to find to find what we need to find. And so I think the other way speculative fiction can work is to immerse us in those possible futures so that at least for the duration of the story and maybe for longer, we actually are in a different reality, a reality that acknowledges the hell that is coming and is already here, but also finds these places where we can regenerate, rebuild, adjust, and change the situation and change ourselves in the process. And so one way to put it is that it can provide different paradigms than those of globalized modern industrial civilization. Paradigms that are inspired by indigenous ways of knowing, for example, that see the world in this hyper-relational way, which is much more true to the world than the way that we've been taught to see it. And so, so I think that those are some of the things that storytelling can do. I also have been feeling more and more as the climate crisis and the other interrelated planetary crises just keep getting worse and worse. Like this year, for instance, ocean acidification, we crossed that boundary. It's the 7 out of 9 planetary boundaries that was violated. And whereas even violating one, I think, puts us in a high risk for planetary, peril. So, I keep thinking that we need to change how we even think about storytelling, that it cannot simply be limited to the written word on a page that a few people will pick up, that we have to be far more bold, audacious, creative, and risk things out there. For instance, take oral storytelling. Maybe we need to read stories aloud to each other in groups because that does something. The voice does something that, words on a page may not be able to do. Maybe we need to take storytelling to the next level and have it as part of street theater so that we have flash mobs of stories being told that that not only convey the urgency and so on, but possible other futures. Because, I think that the project of navigating through our crises is also the project for human and biosphere well-being. And so, in the worst of times, including after major events like earthquakes or, other major catastrophes, people have got together and worked together and shared their troubles, and there's a kind of happiness that comes in these dire moments, which I wish we had a different word for it, but that is something that is really, really, worth pointing to. That it's not it's not necessarily all gloom and doom, that there's this hard-won, hard-fought for joy in acting together for a better world that we lose sight of because we live these hyper-individualized lives in a culture that really emphasizes individuality and selfish behavior. But we are not, that's not all we are. And that's, I think, one of the things that storytelling can do.
I love that the mention of joy. I think fundamentally we need to still have a relationship of joy that's connected to hope and when we think about the future. Because if we only have negative emotions when we think about the future, then it's going to be much harder for us to get to these positive futures that we actually want. So Manana, as a card carrying, recently endorsed expert and researcher on imagination, how do you think storytelling and imagination, what role can they play?
So that's a big question for me, and I think most of the things I can say about this would be rewording what Vandana already said. Humans are storytelling creatures. So I think the greatest power of the story is that it can make meaning for us, right? We learn through and we make sense of the world through story, individually, but also collectively. And so it has this stories have this important function, first of all, to help us understand and learn about what this thing climate change actually is. How to understand what ocean acidification means, right? That doesn't mean anything to anybody unless you, through a story, might learn what it feels to experience the impacts of ocean acidification on certain life forms, on humans. So a story allows us to actually understand what climate change does by sending us into a future place, letting us see through the eyes and experience life through the eyes of other characters that is not ourselves, or maybe even through animal eyes, right? So we can, they help us experience mentally, simulate and experience things that we otherwise would not be able to through our own lives, right? So they massively expand our possibility of experience. And thereby they also allow us then, when we share stories, to identify possibly desirable futures and undesirable ones and talk about them, right? To discuss what in that future might have, so we can share our values through those and maybe agree on what we want to pursue. And in the same story, we can maybe learn how to get to a particular future and how not to. So solutions can be explored, right? So they can also help us maybe gain agency for action. So they can do, I think, a lot of these things for us. But they have, I think, important limitations and also risks associated with them. And that is that we, of course, need many stories to explore the many different kinds of possible futures and perspectives and values that are possible or are at risk. And we might actually not get all the voices that are needed and all the different kinds of stories that should be part of our conversations. Certain stories and certain storytellers might have more power and more influence and being heard more compared to others. So again, power makes a big difference in terms of whose stories dominate our conversations. And of course, not just those of us who are concerned about climate change tell stories or use stories, but also others who are making the case that we need to go back to fossil fuel-based societies and lives, and that the environment is not something we need to worry about compared to other goals in our lives. So story is a tool, but that is we need to also be careful in terms of who's using it and how to make it more inclusive. So, and of course, it cannot replace the actual use of power and the actual making of change, right? It might lull us into the idea that yes, change is possible, it will come, desirable futures are there and accessible, and might let us sit back while the opposite is needed, right? We need stories and other reasons to get us out of our seats and actually make a change, because things cannot stay as they are.
Thank you. Yeah, well said. So, speaking of power, it's time to bring more people into this conversation. So let me turn to some of our questions from the chat. One is calling back to the COVID pandemic. Humanity seemed to pull together during the global pandemic. Why do you think international governments aren't able to do the same in confronting the climate crisis?
Let me tackle this one. It has to do with, again, proximity and perceived or the temporality of the problem. With COVID, it is immediate. People were dying within days, right? So you'd have this the death counter of people going up and the spread of the disease happening within days and weeks and months. You could project the millions of deaths. So the need to act and the impacts of the problem were just so massively visible and immediate, which made all the difference compared to how we think about the climate change problem. Because the climate change problem is spread out over time, both in terms of how long it takes for things to cause effects and then for these effects to show up. And then again, the cause and effect are not in the same place. And those who act on climate change, the impact of those actions will also be felt in very different places. So not necessarily in the same, the government that acts will not necessarily benefit its own citizens immediately, right? So the disconnect, both spatial and temporal, between action and impact is so different between COVID and climate change, which justified action on COVID so much more easily than it does on climate change. Although climate change has by now probably killed thousands of people, I don't know how many thousands, but a large number of people already, and affects people's livelihoods, well-being in so many ways already that is very hard to aggregate. But it is harder to aggregate and to account for compared to COVID deaths, right? Which was so much more countable, let's say, problem that is easier to justify policy actions. And it justified an extraordinary amount and scale of governmental action and restrictions on people's lives that seems unimaginable to justify in the context of climate change.
So this next question is from Christiana, who writes, if we're facing things like AMOC, which is that Atlantic Ocean current that you were talking about, Manana, if we're facing things like AMOC collapse and Trump and other far-right figures are taking us backwards, what gives you hope that we can stay safe? Do we need to be looking at things like sunlight reflection, or I'll bracket that and say what are called geoengineering type of solutions? Or do you think that the world is about to get its act together before 2030? Vandana, it seems as a physicist, maybe we should be turning to you for this one.
Well, I'm sure Mariana can add something really valuable to this. But I can say this much that, well, I can't predict how politics will go, other than I put my faith in resistance, and putting roadblocks in the way of some of these projects of strongman type, populist authoritarian leaders that we see around the world, and hopefully increasing resistance, and maybe other people in other places acting in ways internationally that would limit what they can do. But I also want to state that some of these last resort type measures, like solar geoengineering, are very, very problematic for a couple of reasons. One is that I don't think that we know. I mean, it's assessing the Earth as though it's a machine, and the Earth is not a machine. So the solution comes from a way of thinking that is actually close to the way of thinking that caused the problem in the first place. And it's a kind of mechanistic worldview that you kind of look at the world from a distance and you tinker with a few things and you got it. But we don't know enough about the Earth system to know whether this is going to have the effect that is intended. And we also don't know about the other consequences that it might have, the ones that we can't predict because we're talking about a complex system. But the other thing also is that if things like solar geoengineering get underway, it puts disproportionate power on the companies and governments that actually do solar radiation management, for example, because it means doing this every year, and that would give an excuse to fossil fuel companies to keep spewing their fossil fuel, their CO2 into the atmosphere. And then the companies, and often they're the same people, putting the sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere, would have to do that every year and put more and more and more in it. And then we don't know what the long-term climatic and environmental consequences of that are going to be. So that would, in my opinion, be kind of a path to hell, and rather than a real solution. And the real solution has to do with actually cutting down on fossil fuel emissions and usage, and cutting down on power hierarchies, and cutting down on the violation of other planetary boundaries like biosphere integrity and so on. And that is much harder to do, and it seems impossible to do, but the stakes are just too high. We have to do the impossible. That's just my perspective. But I'm curious to hear what Manana might say, if you'd like to add something.
I can add a short comment, maybe not too much, to have a little more time for other questions too. But the question was, what gives us hope to stay safe? And I think we had, over the last decade or so, a story of amazing change when it comes to the expansion of renewable power. We have seen actually tipping points in the adoption of solar and wind power in certain markets around the world. And the economics are clear that it is the better and cheaper distributed, more democratic solution to this in this form of power, and it will keep growing. I think there is no way that we will turn on that, even if in some countries, including the US, the current trend is to try and contain it and move back towards fossil fuels. I don't think that can and will succeed globally. So we have seen massive success in some of those domains that will move in the right direction. I think we will be seeing the plateauing of CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere actually soon. Doesn't mean that it will keep us safe, because I think we're already far too late to be safe. We will see bad things that are now unpreventable, but there is my hope is still in many of the signs of change that are, for example, part of the stories in this book, in this wonderful book, and the many examples of change around the world, including the one that I just mentioned, and the self-interest of communities, cities, and countries that now increasingly recognize how much climate change will impact the well-being of every human being and of every government and of every economic sector in the world. So there's just that recognition, how that will end up generating self-protective behavior and fight climate change. And maybe just two more words about solar geoengineering, in addition to Vandana said. I agree with most of what she said. It is at most a band-aid over a symptom, right? Especially geoengineering would only limit our temperature, cool us down for a while doing nothing about the CO2, which means it could buy us time for more CO2 emissions, keeping temperatures from rising while we do it, but it doesn't actually deal with the problem. And it generates its own new sets of risks that we poorly understand. So I think it would be a risk increasing, not solution, because it doesn't actually make the problem go away. It just holds it off for a while, pretending that it's not getting worse. So I don't think it's a good idea. And it's not what would make us safer. That's just my 2 cents about it. But there are lots of things to be said about this.
Yeah, we could have a whole other hour easily filled with just a conversation about that. So much of what we're talking about here is about time and our relationship with time and how much time we think we have or how much time we think we need to change things. So I want to ask one last question that I think cuts to the heart of what we've been talking about today. Do you think, this is another question from the chat, do you think local initiatives will be enough in confronting the climate crisis? Or will an international effort beyond COP, the Congress of Parties, the UN climate process, will something beyond COP be needed?
I think we'll need both. We'll need everything, right? So we do need all these local initiatives and more of them. We need to network them and scale them, help them generate scale and speed as much as we can. But at the same time, much of this is, of course, also driven and fostered and facilitated by a UNFCCC Paris Agreement kinds of frameworks and ideas and norms and policies that then move through national legislation and make these things possible or help them. So we need those, and we probably also need a couple of new things that are outside and beyond this existing body of international climate change negotiations. Yeah, so we'll need innovative thinking in terms of governance as well, especially now that always a think toolkit more, very likely.
Thank you. We lost the last little bit of what you said, if you want to repeat it.
I said just that it's everything in the toolkit and more that we will likely need. Am I still here?
Yes, you're here.
Yeah.
You exist.
Sorry about that.
But thank you. Yes, we need everything in the toolkit and more.
No.
We need new things as well.
The short, yeah.
Yeah. Vandana, I'd like to give you the last word. Would you like to respond to that question as well?
Very quickly, I'll try to not be professorial and go on at length. But yes to what Mariana said. We need everything at every scale of space and time. And I want to point people to this beautiful, beautiful essay by Native American Potawatomi scholar Kyle White, which is called Time as Kinship. And it is free on the internet. And which is that linear time is not the only way and should not be the only way to think about the dire nature of the problems that we confront. It's very important, but it's not the only way. And so I just want to point to that because it really points to how interactions and relationships are absolutely key, and that there's different ways to think about time that are no less important for responding urgently, but do not have some of the limitations of the linear time narrative. So yes, I think that we have to be bold and audacious and humble and just radically love, because ultimately, and this is something scientists don't like to use the word love, but I'm going to say it anyway, that you can't defend what you don't love. And sometimes we are afraid of loving to the hilt because it's so painful, but it's still worth it. So I hope we love the earth and future generations and each other and non-humans enough to do what needs to be done.
Thank you. What a wonderful place to end this conversation. Thank you so much to our panelists. Thank you to Joey and all of the folks at New America who helped us put this event together. And thank you all for joining us today. We hope you enjoyed the conversation. Please check out the book, and we'll see you next time.